It's free and open to the public. It starts at 4.
So somehow I think the Trump administration quite purposely ratcheted up the tension. A week ago it was talk of assassinating Kim Jong-un. This weekend talk of a preemptive strike.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. We record on April 21st. Today, Palestine, Korea, Yemen, Syria, and a bit about Bahrain. First, the good news. An Israeli judge has temporarily suspended Omar Barghouti's travel ban, so he will be able to travel from Israel to Connecticut to get the Gandhi Peace Award along with Ralph Nader, thanks to the 900 who signed the petition to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Meet both of them Sunday, April 23rd, at the award ceremony. It's free and open to the public. It starts at 4. Come 15 or 20 minutes early to get a good seat. The SSS building is at 1 Prospect Street on the corner of Grove. We'll begin the program with a little video of Barghouti and Nader, the co-winners of the award. Nader was on Democracy Now!, talking about how airline passengers won the little rights they have.
Bright morning in April 1972, I went to National Airport in Washington, take an Allegheny Airline flight to address a large downtown rally in Hartford, Connecticut at noon. And I got there with a confirmed ticket, and they said, the plane is full, you can't get on the plane. I said, I have a confirmed ticket and a confirmed seat. I'm sorry, the plane is full. Behind me was an assistant to Senator Ribicoff, whose name was John Koskinen, who's now the IRS commissioner. And he was bumped too. So I found myself a wonderful public interest lawyer, Reuben Robertson. He took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. In a 9-0 decision, the court ruled that if you are bumped with a confirmed reservation, you have a case under the doctrine of fraudulent misrepresentation. And so we went down to the lower court and the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they required the airlines to put a notice on the ticket counter in all of our tickets saying that if we are bumped, we're entitled to some form of compensation. What form was to be decided by the airlines, and they decided to auction off the seats. And it worked like a charm 99% of the time. And where it doesn't work is where the airline gets chintzy and offers vouchers instead of cash. And what United Airlines did, and the flight from Chicago to Louisville, when they wanted to get 4 seats emptied for 4 flight attendants deadheading it to Louisville to get on another plane, was offer vouchers that expire in 1 year. And they got 3 out of the 4, and they picked a doctor, Dow, and called the security when he objected and dragged him off the plane, and 1 billion people have seen that. But why did they do that? Because they didn't want to offer cash. And why didn't the customer have a right to stay on? Because the contract of carriage, which is on the UAW website, is 67,000 words long and fine print, and it takes away the rights to be assured that when you have a confirmed reservation and you're in the seat, you can stay in the seat. Total unbridled discretion by the airline to throw you off the plane. So now the stage is set, because so many people are outraged, for getting the Passenger Bill of Rights legislation through Congress, which has been mired for decades because of the airline lobby.
Now to Omar Barghouti, a few minutes from a speech he gave at Yale University in 2013.
Before I start my presentation, I want to recognize the Native American nations and tribes whose territory we're standing on today, and to tell them from one dispossessed nation to another, we stand with you in your struggle for justice, dignity, and rights. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of Africa's most prominent contemporary writers, wrote in the introduction to his book, Decolonizing the Mind, how imperialism presents the peoples of the earth with the ultimatum, accept theft or death. He says, the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism against the collective defiance is the cultural bomb. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It even plants serious doubts about the moral rightness of struggle. Possibilities of victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. This applies to the occupation of Palestine and to the ethnic cleansing that Palestinians had to suffer when Israel was established.
Palestinian Prisoner Day this year led to a hunger strike of 1,000 prisoners. They want terrible things like more family visits, an end to solitary confinement, better health care, and greater access to education. And a sign of how things have changed, the New York Times published an op-ed from Omar Barghouti, who is serving 5 life terms. He explained the reason for the strike in the Times op-ed. The Zionist press went into a tizzy over the Times action, condemning the newspaper for not telling readers that Marwan Barghouti was in prison for murders. Well, those facts are true, but the Times also reports on Netanyahu and what he says without mentioning his role in the mass murders of Palestinians in Gaza. Israeli authorities have proclaimed the hunger strike actions illegal. They punished Marwan Barghouti for writing the essay by changing his prison and throwing him into solitary. Now to Korea. Donald Trump has threatened the North Korean regime, saying he was sending an armada near their shores. It came out the battle group he mentioned was actually steaming away from Korea towards Australia. However, we are reluctant to mock Trump over this for fear he will decide he has to prove his manhood by bombing something. Now to a real expert over Korea, Bruce Cummings, who spoke on Democracy Now!
Each crisis is treated as if it has really no background. The fact is that American nuclear intimidation of North Korea goes back to the Korean War. After the Korean War in 1958, we installed hundreds of nuclear weapons in the South, the first country to bring nuclear weapons onto the peninsula. And North Korea has essentially, since the late 1950s, had to find a way to deter the U.S. from using those weapons. For decades, they built underground. They have something like 15,000 underground facilities of a national security nature. But it was inevitable that when threatened with nuclear weapons, and Chris is right, President Obama threatened North Korea with nuclear weapons many times by sending B-2 bombers over the South, dropping dummy bombs on islands and so on. It was just inevitable that North Korea would seek a deterrent. And what is, to me, so insane about this, particularly this last weekend, when somebody purposely leaked to NBC that the U.S. was considering a preemptive strike, what's so terrible about it is that you essentially get a standoff with North Korea having nuclear weapons, the U.S. having nuclear weapons, but North Korea not being able to use them anywhere without being turned into a charcoal briquette. That was General Colin Powell's reference to what would happen if North Korea launched a nuclear weapon in anger. So somehow I think the Trump administration quite purposely ratcheted up the tension. A week ago it was talk of assassinating Kim Jong-un. This weekend talk of a preemptive strike. I don't think Vice President Pence is right that what President Trump has done shows strength and resolve. It's one of the easiest things to fling 59 cruise missiles into Syria. Apparently the military has wanted to test this Moab, mother of all bombs, for some time, and they went ahead and did it. It's not clear what the outcome of either strike is, and it seems that Mr. Trump, who ran on an anti-interventionist platform, is actually enjoying the toys that the military can provide to him, and perhaps using them in Korea, which would be a complete disaster.
Bruce Cummings, I wanted to ask you again about the historical record here. A lot of people forget the severe crises that have occurred between the United States and North Korea over the years. Back in 1968, for example, Korea seized the Pueblo, which was a surveillance ship right off its shores, and held more than 80 U.S. sailors prisoner for a year before the United States apologized as part of a settlement. And a year later, in 1969, North Korea shot down a U.S. surveillance aircraft where more than 30, I think, U.S. Air Force members were killed in that incident. So there's been a historical brinksmanship situation between the United States and North Korea, especially with the U.S. constantly, as Christine Hong said, displaying aggressive military actions and surveillance over North Korea.
Well, that's right. I actually was in Seoul when the Pueblo was seized in January of 1968. I was in the Peace Corps at that time. That created an enormous crisis. Lyndon Johnson wanted to hit North Korea in retaliation, but was informed that our bombers in South Korean bases, our bases in South Korea, only had nuclear weapons. But I think the crisis that most clearly resembles the one over the weekend, or the one we're in the middle of now, is in June 1994, when Bill Clinton nearly launched a preemptive strike at the Yongbyon plutonium facility. You may remember that former President Jimmy Carter flew to Pyongyang, had a discussion with Kim Il-sung, and out of that came an 8-year freeze on all of North Korea's plutonium. So an easy way to solve this problem would be to revive direct talks with North Korea, normalize relations with North Korea, assure them that we don't plan to attack them, and just through those means bring down the really terrible tension that existed over the weekend.
Well, during his trip to South Korea, Vice President Pence announced the U.S. would move ahead with deploying the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, despite opposition by China.
We will continue to deploy the THAAD missile defense system as a defensive measure called for by the alliance and for the alliance. We will continue to evolve a comprehensive set of capabilities to ensure the security of South Korea. And as our Secretary of Defense made clear here in South Korea not long ago, we will defeat any attack, and we will meet any use of conventional or nuclear weapons with an overwhelming and effective response.
So if you could talk about this, Professor Cummings, as well as the failed missile launch this weekend of North Korea, what it's about, and their parade where they had these two huge, it's not clear what was in them. Was it intercontinental ballistic missiles, or meant you to believe that? Talk about each of these.
Well, the THAAD installation is completely political. The THAAD anti-missile system does nothing to stop North Korean ICBMs. It's for short and medium-range missiles. Furthermore, it's not clear that it works. Anyway, South Korea has been under threat from North Korea's short and medium-range missiles for decades. It's political in the sense that they shoehorned it in there before the May 9th election, when a progressive named Moon Jae-in may well become president, and return to a policy of engagement with North Korea. And there will be a lot of estrangement between Seoul and Washington and the Trump administration if that election comes out as most people predict.
Of all the things that are on Trump's table, one is a preemptive strike against the North. Preemptive is a nice way of saying an offensive attack out of the blue, like a Pearl Harbor. The results would be catastrophic. The North might become a cinder, but what of the South? What about the city of Seoul with 12 million people, including 8,000 American citizens? They'd all be sacrificed for what? Now a tiny bit about Syria. This man, Salim Saloum from Kafranbel, was confirmed dead after years in a hideous Assad prison. Kafranbel is famous for the witty banners its residents make. It's a town that is victimized by Assad bombs and fundamentalist rulers. Now to a hunger strike in front of the United Nations, a protest against a forgotten war, the Saudis and U.S. against Yemen, the poorest Arab country in the Middle East. I'll be speaking with Cathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She and several score others have just finished up a week of fasting to protest the war against the Yemenis. Good morning.
Good morning, Stanley. Thanks for the invitation to be on your show.
So you're still in New York. I understand the fast ended last night?
That's right. We broke fast after being with people in front of the United Nations throughout the weekdays and also on Saturday. And we know that sort of following up on this action, there are people in Chicago and in Fresno, California, getting actions ready, and also we were accompanied by people in D.C. doing some very creative actions.
So describe the conditions of your fast. Was it bread and water, or what did you do?
Well, there was, I think, about 15 people who were taking only liquids. And, you know, by the end of 6 days of not having any solid food, you do become hungry. Hungry as horses, my friend Brian Terrell put it. But, you know, it's so important then for us to recognize there are people who've gone for months without food, watching their children starve, trying to migrate to places where they hope they might be met by humanitarian aid, and they get there and there's nothing. Iona Craig talked about people who were eating the trees. They were so hungry.
Mm. How many were involved in the protest day to day at the UN?
I think there were about 30 to 40 people each day. One day we had 45. A very lively marching band came one day and played. It worked. They did songs kind of clamoring, yearning for mercy and peace and justice. And then a woman did a very interesting dance. And members of the Yemeni community joined us at various points. And we had excellent speakers, people who so generously went out of their way to come down and be with us. For instance, William Hartan, one of the best experts on U.S. weaponry. And we were also joined by Luke Nephew of the Peace Poets. And there are YouTube videos up that people could go and see. There's a very moving one where Amy Nee and her child Eli, who is in her arms, talk about the conditions of parents who can't feed their children. And Amy says she can't imagine it. She couldn't bear it.
Mm. Now, I saw some of the signs and banners. We put them up on the Struggle TV. Could you say some of the slogans, perhaps, that were on these signs?
Well, one slogan was that there are no military solutions in Yemen. And then we were also so aware that the United States is slashing humanitarian aid budgets to assist the UN in helping not only Yemen but also Nigeria and South Sudan and Somalia, where there's a trio of famines that are now developing. They're near famine conditions now. So feed the hungry, and whatsoever you do to the least of these, which would have some resonance with some of the people who are familiar with Christian scriptures. We had Yemen is starving as one of our slogans, and we felt like we're fasting for Yemen because Yemen is starving is a simple part of the message, but also no military attacks on Yemen and lift the blockade. Mm-hmm. A number of us were involved in trying to break the economic sanctions against Iraq when that whole country was placed under siege, more or less, and so many people died because of starvation and disease, including hundreds of thousands of children, maybe 500,000 children just under the age of 5. And so now we're looking again at a similar crisis, and instead of the nations of the world saying, how can we help these children who may die this tortuous death by starvation, people have imposed a blockade. The Saudis and the U.S. particularly have, the U.S. collaborating, have imposed a blockade on a major port, one which imports 70% of Yemen's food. Yemen imports 90% of its food, but 70% of it comes through the port of Hodeidah. And the Saudis have arranged a naval blockade, and they've destroyed every crane that would have lifted food from the boats into the trucks and allowed for transport. The Yemenis don't have enough fuel to put gas in their vehicles and move needed goods. And besides the blockade, there have been constant airstrikes, and now the United States has also been making strikes, such as the one in Al Ghayal, when the Navy SEAL, Chief Petty Officer Brian Owen, was killed, and the tragedy for that family certainly begs condolence. But what about the 29 Yemeni civilians who were killed?
And they wiped out that town, I understand, in the weeks afterwards.
Yeah, and people, sometimes the drone operators talk about people who run away from bombings as scorchers.
Yeah.
Well, that's a terrible term in and of itself, scorchers. But the report on Al Ghayal that we read, that Iona Craig helped to file, writing for The Intercept, said that a mother and her children were running away. Of course she would run, and then they were killed.
Terrible.
So that never gets mentioned when the United States media people are filming and listening to a 4-minute standing ovation to offer condolence to the widow of the Chief Petty Officer Navy SEAL who was killed in the middle of a horrendous night raid operation. There's no mention of the civilian Yemenis who experience a nightmare and are bereaved and don't have breadwinners and must flee and become refugees.
Now, getting back to your protests, did passers-by stop and talk to you? Any UN diplomats?
We did find that there was quite a lot of conversation. Some people came back and joined us the next day. One young woman brought her mother with her. People took our flyers. We needed to reproduce the flyers every day. We didn't find, I think maybe once we heard somebody say, get a job. But otherwise, I think the response was one of concern. And one UN worker said, I can't identify myself, but I sit next to the person who works on issues regarding Yemen. And my colleagues' heads are in their hands, and they feel great remorse, and they're very, very grateful that all of you are out here.
Good. How about media coverage by left media or corporate media?
Well, Democracy Now! Invited me to be on their show, and I believe that their segment specifically on Yemen will be on their website. They also had paid a lot of attention to the massive ordnance air charger bomb that had been dropped in Afghanistan. And then I guess I had about 6 or 7 other interviews, Madison, Portland, Jeremy Scahill with The Intercept, and sorry, the other places are escaping me, but there was alternative media coverage, and things have gone out on YouTube. In terms of the mainstream press, we have very, very little expectation of coverage.
Right. Now you have a Facebook page. I believe it's called Fasting for Yemen. Is that right?
I think so. Right.
And I was impressed. You posted a video from a Yemeni American who talked about what was going on internally in Yemen and explained that while what the Saudis were doing was awful, that didn't mean that the Houthis and Salah forces were positive themselves.
I mean, the country has been ripped apart by a very savage civil war. Certainly we agree with the UN people who say silence the guns to all sides, silence the guns. Some people have wondered if there might even be, during the month of Ramadan coming up in June of this year, a call for a ceasefire. I don't think it's the I don't think it's the right of the United States to say who should get the upper hand in any of these civil wars that are raging around the world. But I do hope that the United Nations could play a role in bringing all sides together to seek negotiation, and that all of us can say militarism is not the answer. And then, we in the United States have to deal with the fact that we've given, over the years, $315 billion of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, $115 billion under the Obama administration.
According to a report from his daughter Mariam, Abdulhadi al-Khawaja is on hunger strike, protesting miserable conditions in the prison cell in Bahrain. Al-Khawaja was beaten in front of his children several years ago, taken to prison, and a judge gave him a life sentence. Bahrain is a kingdom which crushed its democracy movement years ago. The U.S. Fifth Fleet has a base there, so human rights be damned. Both Obama and Trump love this king with all their might. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this has been The Struggle.